Yeah.
Yeah.
We got a lot of.
We love it. But I was thinking either a Target or a dog or. Not like. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I was just maybe.
Yeah.
That'd be good.
Yeah. I just figured. Not. Yeah.
Just saying that.
So it gets long, so we're gonna take strong. Everything will be over.
Yes, okay. It's on that table right there. Feeling well.
What do you guys do?
Yeah, yes.
George, I'm on.
Well deserving of retirement.
I'm muted, Joe.
Yeah.
I'll just wait one more minute. Everyone.
I can be a bit much. Yes.
So we asked if we get there.
Yeah. You know, really tired. That's the secret. If they're still like, with the news, they're going to wake up in time to be.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Aloha. Thank you all for being here, for your commitment to this task that we have for us. Appreciative that we're all still coming to the meeting here. And just want to appreciate all the journey that we've had up until this particular point as we approach the next legislative session. We have a lot of information to throw out there today. So I'm just gonna go and stick our heads into it and just move forward with this meeting. Appreciative of your time. I'm gonna go through a roll call real quick to see who we have here live and online. I'll just go down the list that I have here. Judge Souza here. Lisa Itamura here. Brenda Bauer Smith. Tommy Johnson here.
Here, yeah.
Brenda? Yeah. Okay. Kuike,
Present.
Fred. Yep. Ben Lowenthal. Mark Hashem. Glenn Wakai. Steve Arm. Keola. Here. Yep. Andrew.
Andrew Kennedy.
No, I was Andrew Martin.
Easy mistake.
Sheldon, Pamela,
Here.
Miles,
Present.
Brandon. Andrew, Kennedy.
Yeah, I'm here. I also know Ben Lowenthal and Brandon Segal are going to try to log on. They have court though this morning, so I don't know what we want to do about that, but they're trying to attend, but I'm not sure.
Thank you. Greg DeCosta. Sonoy,
Here.
Martha.
Here.
Jeannie DeMello.
Here.
Oh, gee, that's you.
Yes, we
Yeah. Erin. Kristen's on her way. Jennifer,
Here.
Carl. Cheryl Enoy. Ariel Reynolds. Andrea. Ronnie Barra. Corey. Dennis Dunn. Candice. Pretty much it. I believe we have formed with them. Thank you all again for being here. I'm just gonna move along. Item number 3 on our agenda is the research presentation. I'm gonna ask Aaron to speak before Council of State Government gives their report to brief us on the presentation that we're about to get.
So before we get started with the data today, I just wanted to provide a little context about the 2 presentations you'll be seeing. And a presentation by CHG, a presentation by the Criminal Justice Research Institute. And what we did was, as I listened throughout the task force meetings, and in the beginning, I realized there were a lot of questions about data. We have a lot of stakeholders at the table who care about a lot of different things about minimum terms. And so the goal was to stay really focused on the minimum term scope of the task force and to do the best that we could with the resources and time we had to turn around information to you that could help add more depth to maybe the information we've had prior to this point. So with that being said, you know, there's a lot of limitations in the state to data. You've probably heard or encountered many of these yourselves, and a lot of them have to do with, we have information systems, they're not really data systems designed for research. And so we have to figure out how do we take this information and turn it into data where we can do quantitative analysis. And really, when we do this research, the most time-consuming part of the work that we do is taking this information and transforming it into data sets that we can run statistics. It's not the statistics part. That's actually the most, the quicker part of the project and process. So with that being said, you know, we worked with data that we felt like we could look at in a timely fashion, but also was good data that we could count on to really give you accurate information. And so the focus was to add more depth about minimum terms and what they are and provide a couple different perspectives. And we work with 2 different data sets, so you can kind of see from 2 different ways of approaching this question what we found. Yeah, so I just wanted to kind of lay that context there for you before we get started. And yeah, that's it.
Once again, thank you for the Council of State Government for all the work that they've done in helping us on this journey. Do I call up Carl or Jennifer?
It'll be Jennifer.
Yeah.
So it'll be Angie and I will be presenting. So appreciate it, Mark. Thank you so much. And thank you, Aaron, for that overview and introduction. And really just want to say, I know kind of this is the last task force meeting, that it has been an absolute pleasure kind of providing support for the task force and being able to learn about your culture, your system, how things function in Hawaii. I wish I could be there in person to present to you today, but unfortunately I am not. And want to thank as well BJA for providing the funding for us to support the task force to be able to do some analysis and share with you kind of what other state systems are doing and things like that throughout this past year. And so today, kind of really want to start things off by kind of summarizing some of what has been done to date with the task force, And then digging in on what we were able to estimate with trends with the data through DCR. DCR has been a wonderful partner with sharing data with us and actually had kind of quite a bit of data going back to 2006. So kind of really robust kind of length of data that we have available. And then just discuss any additional opportunities to advance safety and second chances in Hawaii and any additional technical assistance needs that Hawaii might have. And so to really kind of set the context and bring us back to why we're here today, I was looking at the HCR 23 mandate, which was to examine and make recommendations around minimum term setting by the Hawaii Paroling Authority and to increase the efficiency of the procedures and processes that are in place, studying whether there's other parole system models used by other states that might be well suited for Hawaii, examining and comparing minimum sentences issued by HPA and the courts to determine differences and recommend whether the administration of justice would better be served by removing the responsibility of minimum setting from the Hawaii Paroling Authority. And so that is really kind of the full charge of the task force to take a look at these items. We have had 5 meetings so far. So this is our 6th meeting over the course of the last year. And if you remember back to last September, we really dug in on reviewing different ways that states arrange their sentencing systems and prison systems. So highlighting a variety of different ways that states approach minimum sentencing terms. Some of them are utilizing sentencing guidelines. We also reviewed recommendations around the model penal code and what it recommends for sentencing. And if you remember back to the model penal code, you know, you definitely see overlaps with the philosophy of what's utilized in Hawaii with ensuring that sentencing is proportionate, it's considering rehabilitation, deterrence, victim harm, reintegration is being taken into account for people who are returning back into the community. And then as a system, the model penal code looks to ensure that there's still some discretion to individualize sentences, as well as promoting some sort of uniformity and consistency across sentences to ensure fairness and equity in how sentences are handed out, and ensuring that there's transparency in that decision making through the use of data and research to see what's happening in those sentencing decisions. And so we did this September of last year. In November of last year, we walked through some of the state constitutional and statutory provisions for sentencing in Hawaii and really broke down the roles of judges, prosecutors, defense counsels, victims, DCR, and the Hawaii Paroling Authority, what is happening in each stage of the process, what information is available at each stage of the process for each of those stakeholders. In March, we looked at mock scenarios for holding minimum hearings. So Chair Fred Hune did an amazing job kind of setting out those mock scenarios so that task force members could have insight into how decisions are being made in terms of setting those minimum sentences. And then in June, discuss some of the common features of indeterminate sentences. So Hawaii is an indeterminate sentence where, you know, they have that range at the back end for when they can be released. And then in July, discussing and debating kind of what might potentially be the best strategy if minimum sentencing is with HPA versus the judiciary versus laid out in statute, and discussions around some of the pros and cons of those different strategies. And today we're going to look at some of the data findings, as Aaron highlighted. Ideally, the task force would have received this data in March, and you would have had this kind of well before this point. So recognizing, though, that executing the MOUs, kind of receiving data, figuring out what's available and not available, cleaning and analyzing the data. It took more time than was originally kind of planned and anticipated. So, definitely recognize that, receiving the data at this point in the task force is not the ideal kind of sequencing that, we had going into the project. And for those of you, who work within the system, that there's definitely, and Aaron's honed in on this as well, that there's limitations in the data, and that, the data is not ideal to tell the entire story and picture of what's happening in Hawaii. And so kind of definitely kind of a firm recommendation just from an outside entity is to, take a look at data systems and if there's opportunities to improve data systems to ensure that you're capturing and collecting the data that's going to be meaningful as decision makers within the state would be highly recommended. So before we get into the data, I know some of you haven't been able to attend every single task force meeting with some of our other obligations that we have as professionals in the field. And so I thought it would be good to just provide a little bit of context setting and a little refresher over how minimums are set in Hawaii to just reorient ourselves to kind of what we're looking at and kind of what some of the data means so that kind of you have that context going into some of these data discussions. And so HPA uses guidelines for setting their minimum terms, and the guidelines are set up in 3 levels. And so you can kind of think of it as just a baseline person coming into the system would be at a level 2. If there's mitigating circumstances, they might get bumped down to a level 1. If there's a lot of aggravating circumstances, they might get bumped up to a level 3. And some of those main areas of focus that HPA is considering are the nature of the offense, the degree of injury or loss, criminal history, the character and attitude of the person when they're coming in front of HPA, their efforts to live a more pro-social life, their supervision history, if they've had revocations while they've been on supervision, and involvement in the instant offense. So there's kind of several different categories that they're looking at and kind of determining kind of where they fall in that level 1, 2, or 3 to make that ultimate determination for an individual. And when you take a look at the minimum terms and how they're utilized within the system, you can see kind of how it's structured with the amount of years that a person will serve based on which level they're given. And so if you look here at Class A felonies, the maximum term of imprisonment would be 20 years. And if a person falls into level 1, so there's some mitigating circumstances, they could serve 2 to 5 years in the institution prior to parole release. And when you take a look at the percentage of the sentence that they're serving, you can see that they're serving a minimum of 10% of their overall sentence if they fall into that level 1 category. And so when you take a look at kind of those baseline individuals, without the aggravating and mitigating circumstances, if they fall into that level 2 category, you can see they're serving for a Class A felony at least 25% of their sentence. If they're a Class B felony, at least 30%. And a Class C felony, they're serving at least 40% of their sentence. And so kind of wanted to orient you around kind of these numbers and where your current system is structured, because this is going to be relevant as we take a look at the data and see kind of where people are kind of estimating that they're serving their time in the institutions. And so want to get into the actual trends for minimum terms. And so I am going to turn it over to our researcher, Angie Gunter, who is going to walk us through what some of the data says. And so Angie, I'll tab through the slides for you. So just let me know when you want me to move to the next slide.
Great, thanks, Jen. Good morning, everyone. I'm Angie Gunter. I'm a research manager with the Council of State Governments Justice Center. As Jen mentioned, I'm going to be presenting a summary of our data analysis for the task force. This is my first time speaking for the task force or to the task force, but I have attended some of the meetings in the past. And I'm just going to be providing an overview of where the current status is with our analysis. So with this first slide, we just wanted to show how the size of the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation population has changed over the past 12 years. So this is sort of a table setting of what we're observing in data. This is information that comes from the end of month population reports. So back in fiscal year 2012, the population in DCR was just over 6,000 people. And as of fiscal year 2024, it has fallen 36% down to 3,888. The population of sentenced individuals has also fallen during this time from 5,117 back in 2012 to 2,827 in 2024. So that's a 45% decline. What this means is there are fewer people being sentenced to prison, and the DCR facilities have 2,000 fewer people in them than in 2012. We also have on this chart the number of minimum term hearings held by the Hawaii Paroling Authority according to the annual reports. You'll see here, it looks like there's an increase of 23% from 2023 compared to 2012, but I think that might be a change in the way HPA is reporting their minimum term hearings. I'm not sure about that, but it seems to have gone up from 2021. So at any rate, as you'll see, the number of minimum term hearings is sort of a proportion of the number of sentenced individuals. And we're going to be looking on the next set of slides at what those minimum term hearings, what those decisions are. So on this slide, I'd like to provide an overview of the analysis that we're going to share this morning. The goal of our analysis was to understand how HPA sets its minimum terms, or maybe not how they set their minimum terms, but what the minimum terms have been set at. Because there's not an electronic database of minimum term hearings available, we looked to the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation as an alternative to look at historical trends. DCR provided us with a data set of admissions to custody from January 2000 through April 2024, so up until May of 2024. The data included all admissions, which includes pretrial and jail admissions, as well as admissions to prison for sentenced individuals. For this particular analysis, we created a subset, which is composed only of people committed to prison, specifically commitments that occurred between calendar year 2005 and calendar year 2023. This subset can include newly sentenced individuals or individuals revoked from probation. For this analysis, we did not include parole revocations, largely because we could not reliably determine in the data whether the minimum parole eligibility date had been updated to reflect a new minimum term. So just for data cleanliness reasons, we did not want to include parole revocations or other kinds of movements in and out. To estimate that HPA level, we calculated the difference between the minimum parole eligibility date and the sentence start date to get a proportion of time to be served relative to the total sentence length. The total sentence length was calculated by taking the difference between the maximum release date and the sentence start date. And we also factored into account any time served during pretrial. So this process allowed us to obtain as accurate an estimate of the sentence length as possible using DCR admissions data. Because we did not have sentencing data. We didn't have any HPA data for this particular analysis. So we calculated these figures. We also wanted to note that additional details such as prior criminal history or risk and needs data were not available. So what we're going to show in the following slides are an estimated breakdown of HPA's minimum terms based on a calculated sentence length and a calculated percent of time to be served, as well as the type of offense, violent, sex, property, drug, other, and the severity of the offense as the two contextual variables in our analysis. So next slide, please. So on this slide, you will see that we have grouped the HPA minimum term decisions into 5-year buckets. And this is just to aggregate the data into a more digestible summary. As you remember back on slide 6, Jen reviewed the 3 HPA levels. Level 1 is the mitigated level, level 2 is kind of your standard, and level 3 is aggravated, indicating a longer percent of time to be served. So for fiscal year 2006 through 2010, you had about a third at level 1, a third at level 2, and just over a third at level 3. The 10 years in between, so fiscal year 2010 through fiscal year 2020, you had similar patterns of decisions where about 48 to 49% were at level 1, about 30 to 32% were level 2, and 20 to 22% were level 3. And then in the most recent 4 fiscal years, there has been an increase in the number of individuals receiving a level 3 minimum term, a very slight decrease in level 2, and a decline in level 1. You'll notice here that I'm referencing fiscal years, and I told you that we're using calendar year admissions data. This is presented at a fiscal year level because we're taking into account the 6-month lag between an admission to custody and the initial hearing by HPA to set the minimum term. So throughout the next handful of slides, you're just going to see fiscal year in terms of the estimated minimum terms, but our data is from January, the admissions data is from January 2005 through December 2023, and the estimated terms are from July 2005 through June 2024. Next slide, please. Okay, so the prior slide showed the data in 5-year buckets. This is showing the data from year to year. There is variability each year, which is likely reflective of the variability in the individuals coming before the HPA. The earliest years, the first 6 years in our data set, there was a remarkably consistent setting of minimum terms during that time period. Approximately a third of cases fell into each of the minimum term categories from fiscal year 2006 through 2011. And then from fiscal year 2012 through fiscal year 2019, there was another consistent period, but it was a kind of adjusted, it was different. So almost half of people during that time frame were estimated to have a level 1 minimum term. About 30% were having a level 2, and about on average of 20% were at a level 3. So those trends started to change in fiscal year 2020. And what we're seeing now is a trend towards longer minimum terms, which has been kind of accelerating over the last few years. 2024 actually has the lowest percentage of people receiving a level 1 minimum term and the lowest percentage of people receiving a level 2 minimum term than at any other time in the last 18 years. I'm also showing in a table on the right the total number of unique admissions, so unique people, which formed our data set. In total, we had 5,725 cases across the 19 years. But as you'll see, these estimated number of cases are lower than the information in the annual reports published by HPA. This is largely because we only included cases in our analysis where we were sure that the fields pertaining to sentence start date, minimum parole eligibility date, and the maximum release date had not been affected by any revocation event or some other movement happening. We just wanted to make sure that we were capturing the first prison admission event and make sure that the quality of the date fields was as kind of untouched as possible to estimate the minimum terms. Next slide. So on this slide, we are calculating the average percent of time to be served by offense severity for each of our 5-year buckets. So what you'll see here are the various felony offense classes, felony A, B, and C, and then you'll see our 2006 through 2010, 2011 through 2015, et cetera. You'll see the condensed buckets. And for the first 15 years of our data set, people who are convicted of felony A offense are required to serve about 50% of their sentence. And then for fiscal year 2021 through 2024, that increased to 65%. For people convicted of a felony B offense, you had 45% minimum time to serve during that first 5 years. That fell down to 40% for the next 10 years. And then in the most recent 4 years, we have about 56% of time to be served. And then for felony C, the story is a little bit different. The amount of time to be served in that first 5 years was 52%. So just over half of a 5-year sentence would be required to be served. It fell down to 43%, and then it went up to 54%. So the difference between 2006 through 2010 and the most recent 4 years is not very great. There was that period in the middle where it had fallen to 2/5, 2 years out of the 5-year sentence. So we've got an overall average by felony class at the bottom, and then an overall average by our 5-year buckets to the right. And you'll see that the 5-year minimum amount of time to be served for fiscal year 2021 through 2024 was 55%. Is there a question? I'm sorry, I can't see anyone.
But, if you look at fiscal year 2021 to 2024, that's when we're in the middle of the pandemic. Some of those minimum terms may have been longer before the person was paroled, because we had canceled a lot of programming because we couldn't do programming because the facilities were locked down, including on the mainland. So I think you got to take that into consideration. And on the chart, the 2 charts before that, we talk about the higher levels of proportion of people receiving level 3 punishment. I think a couple things we could look at is, one, if someone is resentenced from probation to prison, oftentimes they have a whole lot, sometimes a couple of years of pre-sentence credits based on intermittent periods in incarceration while they're on probation. And when they come to the HPA, they may already have enough pre-sentence credits where HPA has no choice but to set it at level 3, because that's the amount of time they have. The other thing to consider is the initial minimum term hearing is actually about 3.5 months, even though the law says HPA has to do it at 6 months. They've got that down to about 3.5 months from the time of sentencing by the court to the time of the actual minimum term hearing. And then the last thing to consider is mandatory minimum terms imposed by the court, where HPA cannot set the minimum lower. It can set it the same or higher and up to the maximum term, because it also affects the data here as well.
I would also like to add in on, I guess it was slide number 9, prison and HPA minimum term hearing trends. So the number of 916 in fiscal year 2023, that's correct, based on the annual reports. However, that doesn't take into account the DCR stats of new admissions based on pretrial, as a pretrial felon or sentenced felon probationer, of 701, which is like 200 plus less than the minimums for individuals set, and that's more consistent through the years dating back from even 2000, FY 2018 and 19. And I think that's a significant figure.
Thank you.
Was this the slide that you were referencing, Fred? I wasn't 100% sure.
Oh,
I think it's slide 10, Jen.
9.
This one?
Yeah, right,
I think it's
The
this
bottom
one.
line,
Okay.
the bottom line there.
Yep.
916. So there's no disputing what we had reported as far as minimum hearing for individuals. But further research on our part, querying with George King and DCR's statistician, when we looked at the new admissions were from pretrial felons and sentenced and new admissions sentenced by the court, the number is really 701.
So that is that 701 new people coming into prison who would have a minimum term hearing?
Yes,
Okay. All right.
and we would have to assume that the difference of 215 were actually already incarcerated on earlier charges, or these are new charges that they were convicted on, and we had to conduct another hearing while they were incarcerated.
Yes, I will say, to your point about the number of hearings relative to what we're showing in the admissions data, what we had was the offensive record. So we're not able to capture all the different charges for which a minimum term is being determined. We're only able to look at, here's your sentence start date, here's your sentence release date. We're factoring in the amount of time in pretrial custody, based on a conversation that we had with a person from the intake department, and trying to get a sentence length from those date fields. And then from those date fields, providing us a sentence length, we're then estimating the parole eligibility. Well, we're estimating what the minimum amount of time to be served is based on the minimum parole eligibility date. So all of these different date fields, sometimes the data isn't very clean. So we eliminated data that we felt like wasn't, perhaps the minimum parole eligibility date occurred before the sentence start date, in which case it indicates perhaps a revocation event or something. So we had to kick out a lot of cases where the HPA very likely held a hearing, but we couldn't determine based on the fields in our data set that it was a new commitment or evidence of a new hearing. So we weren't able to use all of the different admissions, and we're not able to reflect all of the hearings that likely took place. We just wanted to make sure we had clean data to start with. So that is why the number of hearings that are identified in our data set is very much lower than the number of hearings that likely took place. And of course, we don't have any data in the admissions on hearings that might have been related to an appeal or anything of that nature. We did take into account manual sentence overrides. So I was using those manual sentence overrides in our calculations, but I'll just say the reason why we keep referencing this as an estimate is because we don't have details like, here is your sentence length, here are the number of charges for which you have a conviction, here is what the level that HPA set for you, and here's what time we're telling you you have to serve. We're just doing as good a job with the data that we have, and I think it shows some trends because the methodology is the same from year to year, but as Director Johnson mentioned, it's not able to take into account lack of programs that would have taken place, things impacted by the pandemic. We don't have any of that information in administrative data, so that isn't in any way able to be factored into our calculations. And so there might be reasonable, perfectly good explanations for why the trends look like they do. But this is what we have. So
I appreciate the clarification because, you know, what it also doesn't factor in is during the COVID period from February 2020 moving forward, and when the courts were shut down and admissions were reduced significantly, that impacted the number of hearings, minimum hearings conducted for any new admissions that did come into DCR's purview.
mhm,
Because we were under a Supreme Court order, working with judiciary and law enforcement and everybody else, which totally impacted the number of admission and minimum hearings during that 1.5 to 2 year time period.
mhm.
And this is definitely a great example of where, you know, improvements in the data system are really would help kind of provide some of that clarity moving forward. You know, if the state is able to invest in upgrades to the data systems to capture some of those different decision points as people kind of move through the system, to be able to analyze it in more robust ways that are going to kind of be more fulfilling and give you those answers that you want.
But thank you.
And the other thing
Yeah.
too, if I recall correctly, there was about 243 releases as a result of the Supreme Court order from the DCR. Okay.
Thank you, guys. You want to continue? Yeah.
Okay. Great. Slide 15. Okay. So in this slide, we're showing a histogram for felony A offenses, felony B offenses, and felony C offenses. And what we're showing are the proportion of cases falling into HPA level 1, proportion of cases falling into HPA level 2, and proportion falling into HPA level 3. And here I'm giving just the total case count for each. So obviously, people convicted of felony Cs it's the highest number of people in the system. But I think what's interesting to see on this is what's interesting to see is the pattern. So for the first, for felony A offenses, you have more people receiving a level 2 minimum term than a level 1, and you have even more people receiving a level 3 than a level 2. And for felony B offenses, you have almost across the board a third, a third, a third. There's slightly more in level 1, but it's pretty consistent and pretty evenly broken down. And then for offense at a felony C level, you see the opposite of felony A, where the majority of people are receiving a level 1 minimum term. Fewer people are receiving a level 2 than a level 1, and even fewer people are receiving a level 3. So I feel like the pattern is really interesting. It is definitely showing that there is consistency in HPA prioritizing the severity of the offense and the degree of harm that is caused when people commit a felony A offense. Next slide, please. Yeah, okay. So this is showing a breakdown of HPA levels by the type of offense. Here I'm using the offense classes in the DCR data: major violence, sexual assault, other violent, robbery, property, serious drug paraphernalia, and all others. The two types of offenses receiving the longest minimum terms are major violent and sexual assault cases, both having more than 50% of people convicted of those offenses falling in a level 3 category, level 3 minimum term. Less than a quarter of your property, serious drug, and drug paraphernalia cases are ending up with a level 3. You have about 45% of those ending up with a level 1. On this slide, I'm also showing the total number of cases for each type of offense. And as you'll see, property and drug offenses are the majority of offense types for this 19-year period. They make up about 63% of our sample. This is the last of our data slides. So as I mentioned earlier, the only context that we had available in this administrative data was the offense severity and the type of offense to estimate the minimum term. So we've been showing a pattern based on dates, sentence start date, maximum release date, et cetera. We had looked into creating a regression model that would predict the minimum term, a minimum amount of time to be served. But the model was not accurately predicting the decision-making, which is likely the result of the decision-making being complex. There are 7 factors that HPA takes into account when making a decision, and that was not reflected in our model. So ultimately, we did not move forward with that. But these were the trends as we could determine them from the admissions data over the past 19 years. And I know we've already had some questions, but if there are any others, we can address those now before I pass it back to Jen.
One comment. Although the 19-year period is good, and I don't question the methodology and the conclusions based on, the data that is presented. I think, and I'll just show my dinosaur age. If you look at some of the going back 30 years, 35 years, and when we look at a lot of the repeat offenders who initially, when they first came into the system, were given level 1s and level 2s, subsequently maxed out and reoffended to higher levels, which a lot of times created in this last 2 fiscal periods, you'll find that the a higher level in the level of punishment, especially for the Class A type offenses and some of the Class B offenses. So that would require a more comprehensive type of study. But we notice trends go in cycles. And with the offenders, the regular career criminal type offenders, when they first come into the system 20, 30 years ago, they're at lower levels until they repeat offend after they've maxed out. Just wanted to throw that in.
This is all helpful context for folks to be aware of, because we recognize it's not perfect data and, it's not telling the entire story. So it's helpful context and information for the task force members. Any other questions around or kind of input around the data slides?
Good job.
All right. So just, oh, go ahead.
One comment.
Yes, I have a comment, and thank you for the data that you put together. So I appreciate the data collection. But having sat on the board for a period of time, I know intimately how critical it is to look at the 8 factors that weren't included in the data, and you correctly acknowledge that, because without looking at those 8 factors, then the other data is not too meaningful, because it might give people the wrong idea about how the parole board makes a decision. So the 8 factors really play a critical role because you plug in the 8 factors and then you determine what level the person is. So it's not the other way around, you determine the level and the nature of the crime. So you kind of have to look at the individual and physical totality, and then you make a decision in where the person lands. So without having the history and background information, all of which comprise 8 factors, it's hard to make any sense of what the data will tell you. I mean, do you know what I'm saying? It's really the 8 factors that lead you to make the decision. It's not the level, it's not just the crime itself. And there's a danger in looking at just the crime itself. So you could have a verb, class C verb. But if the criminal history says it's a level 3, then you're gonna bump that up to the level 3. To me, what would be more critical is there any data showing that the parole board is acting outside of the guidelines? Are there overrides being considered? That to me would be more meaningful. And if the parole board is consistent in sticking to the guidelines, then maybe if the guidelines changes the minimum terms, that to me would be a more meaningful discussion.
Well, I think along the same lines, I was the administrator for HP for 16 years. And I can tell you this, is that when the board deviates from the guidelines, it's very rare. But when they do, it has to be written and explained in a minimum term notice that goes out. And that's only for the more serious offenses, class A. So I think Cheryl had a good point that without looking at the salient data, doing a deep dive, you don't really get a good idea of how the decisions are made by the parole board and what facilitate those trends that the data shows. But I think if you do have all that other information, then the trends will make more sense. And I think they'll even out more because you'll see that is a very deliberative process that the board uses to make a minimum term decision.
Yeah.
I also added that the minimum terms, although it could be a level 3, there are other mitigating factors that could reduce the years allotted for that level 3. So if there was a history of mental illness or under duress, those factors could be taken into consideration based on either police reports or the PSI, and the number of years that's attributed at level 3 could actually be reduced, although the level would be cited as level 3.
Yep. Yeah, and these are all kind of those factors that we would recommend, being able to capture and track within your data systems, and being able to track what are those, factors that HPA is looking at, where is each individual person scoring on those factors, and then what is the kind of final level that the person is assigned, that 1, 2, or 3, and being able to merge that HPA data with the HPA decision making with the DCR data to be able to tell that story and kind of get into some of those nuances that you're talking about. I know Erin is going to go into some, individual case files that they were able to review to be able to try to give some sort of a snapshot based on file reviews. So they're going to go over that data that you can kind of overlay with what you just heard with Angie. But recognizing that this is kind of the last task force meeting and kind of the conclusion of our technical assistance, I did want to highlight that there's a couple different free non-competitive technical assistance opportunities for the state of Hawaii or different agencies to engage with us in or continue engaging with us in. And so just wanted to highlight kind of what those are. Not kind of for the purpose to go into discussions around them now, but just to let you know what opportunities are out there. And some of those involve kind of long-term commitments like a Justice Reinvestment Initiative, which is a large statewide bipartisan interbranch initiative that's a 2 to 3 year process and kind of very in-depth and rigorous. But there's also kind of flexible short-term technical assistance, which is actually kind of how we were approved to provide technical assistance to this task force with our JRI Assessment Center that allows just kind of a targeted technical assistance. Typically, it's up to a month or up to 6 months for technical assistance, but BJ allowed us to do kind of a little bit longer due to the length of the task force. And there's also a Reentry 2030 initiative that offers free technical assistance to take a look at kind of back end of the system, reentry supports that really looks at kind of the intersections of housing, behavioral health, economic mobility, policy and program evaluations within the institutions and how that's transitioning into the community and continuity of care and continuum of care services to improve reentry outcomes. So just wanted to highlight that those are some of the kind of free non-competitive technical assistance that we have available through the CSG Justice Center. But it has been an absolute pleasure working with each of you and being able to support the task force. And so I will stop sharing and turn it over to Erin with the Research Institute.
Before we begin, I'm gonna call for a 5-minute break. Because we just got a lot of information and we want to clear some of that out before Aaron comes in with more information. So let's just take a 5-minute break at this time. It's 9:55, so we'll reconvene at 10:01. Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Carl. Thank you, everyone.
But I mean, no.
Okay, we'll start in about 30 seconds. Everybody have your seat, please. Thank you for your time.
Can I bring it up now?
Then got pneumonia to the breathe. He could have asked for better.
Okay, 2 more minutes, guys. Sorry, technical difficulties.
Yeah, that'd be a hospital.
Okay. Oh, you ready? All right, thank you.
What I had questions.
And, but no matter what, we can. Even maybe research grab lights and I said, yeah, there's somebody on this side grab them. We provided every year. Those are big to do. I would say Colina, that area, it's Fresno, over 6,300. Still there. Where you going? You go out in the back, you know, I'm getting my children's going. Even carry them the laptop.
Yes.
As we go prepare our PowerPoint for Erin, so she can do her presentation on the setting minimum terms in Hawaii. This for this purpose, let's hear her out. And then after her presentation, we'll be probably going around the room and get thoughts from everyone on all the information that we received today. But we'll get her through the report at this time. Okay, Erin?
All right. So what I probably should, maybe I should add a little more detail before we got started about this approach with the data and how we were presenting things and working through this. So Cheryl, thank you. You kind of provided a segue for us into the next data presentation. So in an ideal world, we would have data from multiple agencies that we would create a nice sentencing data set with all the variables we would expect in terms of how sentencing is predicted. Unfortunately, that's not the world that we have here when it comes to data systems. And as Angie mentioned, you know, and kind of a similar issue that we had as well, but just with different data and kind of a different approach, was that when you're looking at sentencing, there are a lot of macro level predictors, micro level predictors, which means sometimes there's something about individuals or the specific offenses, but also kind of broader characteristics around the setting that sentencing decisions are made in. And so sentencing is actually some of the most complicated criminological research actually for those reasons, but also because we have a lot of goals and expectations about what we want sentences to do, about the purpose of punishment. And so we care about retributive functions, we care about deterrence, we care about rehabilitation. So there's a lot of different outcomes to measure too. But with that said, the approach was to the benefits of the data provided by Department of Corrections is that you can look over time. I realize not having some context is, not ideal and does raise a lot of questions, but that's sometimes the point of data. Sometimes the point of data is to help us find and refine our questions so that we can figure out what data we should prioritize, or kind of, we don't have time probably to wait 5-6 years to collect all the data we need to really get at everything we care about. But if we can start looking at some baseline trends, start getting understanding of what factors we think might be really relating to minimum terms and what we see, we can, as researchers, can do a better job to help refine better data sets, better approaches, and get more specific in the policy questions that we have. So yes, the limitation to the Department of Corrections data is, there are certain characteristics, primarily the big limitation is that we don't have HPA's criteria embedded in that. That's an important limitation. But I do think it's helpful to see trends over time, knowing that you have different board membership, knowing that you have policy changes from the legislature that occur. And so it does give you a sense of how to maybe think about what could be impacting minimum terms at a system level. So I think that's one of the strengths of the data set. And before I get into the specifics of this presentation too, I just want to say also thank you for CSG for assisting, because having their help to clean and prepare and work through data means we have more to share with you today. So thank you so much for doing that. Really appreciate that. And also with the Department of Corrections and the HPA for working with us to make sure we had data to answer our questions about it, particularly for this presentation that I'm going through. We've had to work through paper files at HPA. Through no fault of their own, their data system does not allow them to extract data. So I feel for you having to do annual reports and trying to report out on statistics. But, I really appreciate everyone there, and Corey especially had to do a lot to pull files of your information. And we had research staff there sitting in the conference room, reading, collecting data. And I know that can be a bit disruptive to have people do that. So thank you for doing that, for being a part of that, so that we could at least create a data set to look more at HPA specific decisions and their policies. And then I also just want to acknowledge the people that did the really hard work on this. Is we have Dr. Samuel Choi from the Criminal Justice Research Institute. He led the data collection and analysis of this effort. We also had other staff there. One of my other staff, Ryan McCaskill, also did a lot of data collection. We also had the help of Dr. Michelle Masters from the Department of Attorney General, one of the statistics divisions there. And we're really grateful for her support as well, for the AG's office, giving us that extra help, because reading through those paper files took a very long time. I'll also just let you know too, we had this really great list of 20 things, or not 20, 200 things we thought we could ask. All the different things we heard about, the different perspectives that were at the table. After 2 days on site, it was that list went down maybe to 20, 30 different variables, because it was just impossible to collect all of that information and to have something ready. So that's one of the limitations there. Okay, so I think that's enough context setting and information and background for all of that. Okay, so this is just an outline of what we're going to talk about today. First, I'm going to talk about the sample that we collected. So our approach was to collect 6 months of minimum term hearing data. And, for people who are interested in the research side of what does this population or the sample look like, it kind of gives you a sense of who we're looking at and how it might be generalizable to our understanding of how or who goes before the minimum term board. But it also gives you a chance to maybe look at more information about who's being sentenced to prison and going through this process. We'll also talk about convictions for felony class and common offenses. So knowing that offense seriousness and offense type is playing a role in how decisions are set, wanted to have some descriptive information on that. We also have some analysis looking, and Jill, you already brought this up, so thank you. But looking at how the HPA policy, which is their guidelines on setting minimum terms, is used in practice. So there's documentation in their files about criteria and what are the most applicable criteria when they set the level of punishment. So we collected data on that. The other thing that we did was look at the length of minimum terms people received. So you saw some of that with the CFG presentation, but we're also looking at that too, since we're looking at a different methodology to pulling the data and a different approach so that you can kind of see what we come up with in that way. And then also we're going to just give a big picture overview of what 6 months of minimum term hearing looks like, since we also maybe it would be helpful to get a sense of how these sensitive practices impact the population. All right. So first we'll describe the individuals in our data collection. Next slide. So our approach was to do a time frame snapshot. So anyone who had a minimum term hearing from January through June 2023. In the end, we had 193 unique individuals that we were able to collect data on. And to give you some sense of, again, individuals are often convicted of more than one offense. So about 3 convictions per person on average. So we collected detailed information about all the convictions, but then we also, have it most of the time presented at the individual level. So I'll do my best to make sure I flag when we're talking more about all of the convictions, even if people are in there multiple times. So we looked at paper files, which have a lot of information, and this is information that parole board members look at when they make determinations on how they. Through this information, we found that almost 93% were men. So not a lot of women in our sample, which is somewhat to be expected. And we found that the average age was almost 40 years old. We also have some information on race and ethnicity data as well, to give you some perspective there. So about 35% were Native Hawaiian, 20% white, almost 14% Asian, almost 10% Pacific Islander, and then other. Then some information that I think is really helpful, especially for correctional agencies to have perspective on, about 77% or more were classified as medium or higher on the LSIR. And just to make sure people know what that is, the LSIR is a risk and needs assessment instrument that correctional officers or correctional staff use to assess risk to reoffend. And it's also when you have medium risk or higher, those are the individuals that really need programming and services to reduce their risk. So I thought that information was helpful to you too. And then also supervision status prior to entering prison. So about 40% had been on probation before, and about 5% had been on parole before. All right. So next we'll talk about some summary information on convictions for felony, class, and common offenses. There's also a handout that went today. I figured sometimes tables are kind of a lot to digest in PowerPoint slides, so you'll have that there for some other things. But I thought I would just highlight some of the key takeaways with this information. So first we have felony class for most serious offense. So just trying to give you a sense of 6 months of hearing data, what percentage are felony C for most serious offense, and followed by other classes. And as we can see, about 57% were for felony C's or most serious offense. Important, again, a few things to keep in mind is, again, most people have more than one conviction. And so that's one thing to think about. And also when you think about the criminal justice system, most people are arrested for felony C's, most people are then charged for felony C's, and most people are then convicted for felony C's. So to some extent, you do see these types of trends, largely because that is the nature of crime patterns. But wanted to provide this information as well. The next slide So here's an example of, rather than just look at individuals in most serious offense, we wanted to provide more of the information on all the different convictions, knowing that people had on average 3 convictions. So this shows you the most serious offenses, mostly felony Cs and some felony Bs. And so you can see there the most common offense was promoting a dangerous drug, 3rd degree, followed by unauthorized control of a propelled vehicle, 1st degree, then theft, 2nd degree, burglary, 2nd degree, and so on. So the table there provides some information, just really broken down to the different offenses as well. So again, this is for all the offenses people were convicted of, not just the most serious there. And that's where the tables are available to, if you really wanted to get into all the detail, all the possibilities that we see, and look at those tables. Because a lot of these were 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, but that supplemental information would be helpful. Right, so then we'll get into what we wanted to do was, so part of the sharing of the prior slides was, we know that offense type and offense seriousness does play a role in punishment and sentencing. So some descriptive information there to provide more in-depth information about the people going up for a minimum term hearing. And so here, though, we'll look more at the HPA's policy on how they set those minimum terms and looking at the policy itself. So as a reminder, there is the guidelines for establishing minimum terms of imprisonment, which HPA has. And with this policy, the intent is to provide structure around how levels of punishment are sentenced. So if we have these broad ranges, especially for felony A and felony B, by providing a policy like this, the intention is then to provide more structure around what criteria moves into different levels of punishment. And so this is just a reminder of what those levels of punishment are. All right, so one way that we thought it might be helpful to see how often HPA adheres to their policy and the guidelines. I'll do my best to explain this table. I've had a little trouble trying to work through this, so I'll go through it, and if you have questions or you need to clarify anything, please let me know. So it's color coded for a couple of things. So you'll see under the level 3 column and felony class A, B, and C, it is color coded because there were some instances in those levels that people were recommended for that level, but then were actually got a minimum term outside the recommendation. I don't have the number up there, but I believe it was about 6% of cases were outside the policy. So for those people who like to think of override rates for risk assessment and percentages, there's like a 10% benchmark for overrides. So just to give some perspective here, we see 6% of the time there was an override, so to speak, of the guidelines policy. And what we have here are the ranges, because the ranges are the lower and the higher end. And so as you can see with level 3, the top 3 level 3s, there are some minimum terms that, for example, there's at least one minimum term that is set at 2 for a class C felony. According to HPA policy, the recommendation and the criteria put them at the level 3 range, but HPA gave them a minimum term of 2, which is in the level 2 range. So that's what that was our way of trying to help visually understand the different categories and where people fall and where people might deviate. And again, it was about 6% of the time. And some of the other blue boxes are highlighted because the sample size is small. So when you have 3-4 cases, it's kind of hard to interpret an average and it makes sense of what that really means for a bunch of cases or an entire sample. So that would be that chart. Does anyone have any questions or any clarification on that?
So in essence, all the shaded blue areas represents those that were actually reduced from what the eligible minimum would have been.
Just I realize we have blue and turquoise up there. The
Not
three-
colorblind.
Sorry, the three turquoise, the level 3 felony C, there was, okay, so. Overrides, let's say, occurred in level 3s only for felony C, felony B, and felony A. Where a minimum was set lower than that range, but it was only 6% of cases overall.
So
probably
basically,
about one.
HPA exercised a certain amount of discretion in its actual sentencing of years of a minimum then.
So when you characterize it as outside their policy, it makes it sound like it's impermissible, but in fact, it's really part of their guidelines and the way they act in order to do individualized case assessments, right?
Yeah, and you can clarify this, Fred, but I would say there's a lot of places that have sentencing guideline structures, I'm most familiar with risk assessment. Risk assessments are data-based, you score out according to risk level based on the data, but there's an opportunity to override because there are unique circumstances, there's outliers.
Well, because you phrased it
Just want a low
outside their
percentage.
policy, I thought initially they were violating what their like mandate was in some way, but that's not the case. It's that they permissibly reduced the term, so it's not outside their policy, right?
Okay, I can clarify. It was outside of the grid, we'll call it, that's in the guidelines policy, but then, Fred, you have in policy that there are
So
reasons that you can go
As
outside. the grid.
stated in the earlier presentation, that there are certain factors that HPA can consider to actually, although we set a level, say at level 3, the diminishing factors that may contribute to a lower minimum allows us to do so. But again, it all has to be in writing and justified, as Director Johnson stated
But
earlier.
because our discussion, really the heart of our discussion is who's best able to make these decisions. So if you characterize it as impermissible outside their policy.
Okay, I was not trying to say it was impermissible. I was only trying to
No,
say.
I'm just clarifying because
Okay.
that's what you were saying, and I think that
Okay.
because this goes to the issue of who's best suited to do it. To use language that suggests they're acting outside of their scope in some way. I just wanted to make sure I clarified that wasn't the case.
I don't think that's what she was saying. I mean, when
Well,
you
that's
look
why I
at
asked, it, so
the
I'm clear now.
turquoise, it's showing that it's kind of high, in comparison to like what the standards are, right? So I think that's why she was trying to.
No, I understand her response, thank you.
Yeah, so that was the reason, one of our recommendations earlier was that HPA has the ability to reduce court mandatory minimums in certain cases, which is not allowable at this point in time. All right, thank you.
We'll move on to some other information about HPA's. So again, the administrative policies, that they have is the guidelines for establishing minimum terms of imprisonment, which have then these criteria that are reviewed and are used to place people in different levels. And when we were going through files, we recorded the information as it was recorded in the case file. So our understanding is that it's the most applicable criteria to the minimum term setting that is recorded. And so that was the information we worked from because, again, if you're talking about a policy of any sort, you want to know, are people A, following that policy, and then B, are they following the policy as intended? Or maybe another question is, does that policy, then freak out, say you intend. So our question here was, there's this, the structure to setting minimum terms. There's criteria that are used to make those decisions. And so how were those used to make those minimum term decisions? So based on our review, 1 to 3 criteria as the most applicable to setting the minimum term were recorded. And on average, 1.2, so it's 1, I know you can't really have 0.2 of a criteria, but trying to make the point there a little bit. And that's right, I think I have, want me to try this now? Yeah. Okay, so based on the data collection here, so again, we collected the criteria across all these minimum terms that were set in our file review, and then wanted to give you a sense of how often those criteria, most applicable ones, are being used across these minimum terms. So the most common one you can see on the left is about half the cases had someone where the character and attitude of offender with respect to criminal activity or lifestyle was the most applicable to setting that minimum term. So that one was the most common. Followed by criminal history, nature of offense, and then, excuse me, so the other criteria. So criminal history was the second most, about 28% of the time, and nature of offense, 24% of the time. And then also, so here we just have the overall percentages across all these cases. To provide a little more depth to that information, we also have a table here breaking it down, how the criteria relate to the different levels. So the first one, again, because character and attitude is the most common criteria, you can also see it's used across or associated with the different levels of punishment. And so most often level 3, followed by level 2, level 1, but that also is a bit of a reflection of that there are more level 3s in the sample, followed by level 3s, then followed by level 1. The next most common one again was criminal history. So you can actually, it might be there that you see more often that criminal history is associated with level 3, but again, it is only used in about 28% of the cases. So, and then we have nature of offense, few times with level 1, then followed by level 2, and then most often with level 3. And so then, the other rows, we present them, but again, they're kind of small sample sizes with those specific criteria. Draw too many conclusions.
To add into that. So the character and attitude, you see 50.8%. Greater majority of those cases are probationers who have had multiple opportunities at programs and new conviction and failed probation attempts, whether it was home probation, drug court. So they come through the system, and that might override the number of criminal history convictions. So you'll see 28% of criminal history. That's pretty much set. If you have 3 or more felony convictions, whether it's locally and or nationally, and this doesn't count by crim numbers. Each crim number is 1. Even if you have 5 convictions under that 1 crim number, it still counts as 1. So criminal history is pretty much automatic. 3 crim numbers or more, it's a level 3. 2 felony convictions, level 2. 1 or less will be level 1. But generally, character will be a higher number based on repetitiveness and lifestyle.
Yeah, we can look in to see, if there are some other relationships between that specific criteria. I mean, it was about 40% of the sample overall was on probation prior. So there's, that's still 10% maybe that were not probation or, I was looking at some of those cases actually specifically around probation to see if there was some other information we could kind of pull from there. But I can add that to maybe something to explore a little bit more about that criteria.
The hardest part with the probation revocation is you can go no higher than a level 2. Because that's based on what's the matrix is. If you have 1 probation revocation, then it's automatic level 1, but your character may override that. If you have probation revocation with a new felony conviction while you're on probation, it's automatic level 2. So the numbers you see on probation revocation is going to be relatively low.
Any other questions on this, the criteria, this one, or other slides for clarifications. Okay. So also, so that was one way to look at how HPA is adhering to or using their policy, their guidelines for setting minimum terms policy. And to mostly the focus again was just looking at the recommended levels and the certain criteria to see how they're applied in practice. So for this one, we'll look at the length of minimum terms and so here, one way to do it is to look at the minimum terms within each felony class. Because of course, that is going to influence the minimum term length itself. And so we have the averages presented again, because like possibility of parole, class A felony, we do have fewer cases because again, fewer of those crimes are being committed. Smaller sample size, but even regardless of that, you still see basically a similar trend, which is that the minimum terms, those averages fall about halfway in the range. So the minimum terms tend to be a little bit more than halfway to whatever the statutory max is. So for Class C felony, you see, the max is 5 years, but the average minimum term is 3.1 years. For Class B felony, again, the max is 10 years, and you see the average minimum term is 6 years. And then for felony A, and the max is 20 years, and you see 11.3 years as the minimum term average. So we wanted to provide that information. I know we've seen some averages presented a few different times here. And here I'm presenting the averages because the distributions, the way the minimum terms are set are pretty much normal curves for felony and felony. So within the class felonies, for people who are interested in normal versus skewed curves, that's the way the setting tends to, or the minimum term setting tends to fall. And then for those where we had large enough sample sizes to make sense of the averages and means, we also just broke this out so that you could see the minimum term averages within class, but also layered within the different levels that the punishment levels that were used. And so as you would expect with each increase in level within the class, you see that the average also increases. But wanted to share just how the levels, are associated with different averages within those different class ranges. All right, so before I move to the next section, any questions about these past two slides, just sharing the averages of what we're seeing. Okay.
Would it have made any difference by showing the median type of numbers?
Not when it's broken out like this. Yeah, but one of the other slides, I have the median. Yeah,
Okay.
because it does make a difference.
Thank you.
There made a difference to show the number of minimum term PhD set that match the court posted at the.
I don't, we only collected cases with minimum term, the HPA setting the minimum term.
No, they said all of this, but the court may impose a mandatory minimum. When HPA sees them, they can't set the minimum term lower, they can set it higher. So if all these are clean cases without mandatory minimums to the court.
I'm pretty sure, but I'll make sure in the report. But yeah, because our focus was really getting to minimum terms and this policy process. So wanted to really keep that clear, but I'll triple check that. That's a good
Thank you.
I believe too with the CSG data analysis, they removed mandatory minimums, but we can confirm that too. And the other, yeah. Okay, any other questions about these past two slides before we move on? So here I'll also just talk about the distribution of minimum terms. So taking all of this together, just to give you an overall big picture, we are talking about system that's impacted by all of these decisions and felony classes and crime types overall. So so across the 6 months of minimum terms, people who went up for the parole board, the average minimum term or the median minimum term that was set was 3.5 years, and that was also the most frequent as well. I think the average was actually somewhere around 4 too, so not too far off. So wanted to give you that big picture sense of 6 months of people going up to the parole board. Overall, what is the median? What's the most typical minimum term that is set? As we've seen, is obviously influenced by felony class, naturally, but also around some other things as well. And then you can also see too, even with felony Bs, the max is 10. And then you do see a bit of a spread or distribution that goes below 5 in some cases. So it's not necessarily that with each felony or felony class that you see, a strict concentration within each kind of increase associated with the felony class as well. So this is just to help give you an overall picture of what you see. And in this case, we did remove the life cases. We just kept it to the felony A, B, and C class to provide this picture. So one of the things I thought that would be helpful is, we have some averages, we have some tables, we have a lot of descriptive information. One of the reasons I'll get to limitations in the next slide, but I thought based on all this, what are the things that stick out to me about this data? So one is that, I think it's helpful to understand what are the characteristics of people who are going up to HPA, who are going through the minimum term process, because you're setting minimum term, but you're sending them, to prison with the expectation they'll engage in programs and services, and Department of Corrections too, of course, wants to know, how many of these people need program and services, and what kind of resources do we need to help work with people once they're incarcerated, so that when they're released, their risk is reduced and they're less likely to commit new crime. So I think it's really helpful to know that, about 75% of the people were medium risk or higher. I mean, those are people that need a lot of programs and services to reduce their risk. And so minimum terms are set, and there's averages we've been looking at, but obviously the minimum term is also the first parole eligibility date. So, kind of thinking through, what kind of information, could be helpful for understanding, who's coming before you and how to best prepare them for release in a future date. Another thing too is about a little under half have been on post-conviction supervision prior. So most of that was people on probation before. I want to say half of it was maybe felony C classes, their most serious offense. So I think that is partly why you're seeing some of the felony C's in this data. And then another finding, of course, which I don't think is too surprising, is there are a lot of felony C's that are part of this process in getting minimum terms. And I think this is where more data and a more bigger picture sentencing perspective would be helpful, because, of the felony C's that are going up in front of the parole board, are they the most serious, maybe the ones who were on probation and didn't succeed, and so we're kind of reserving a prison for those people, or are there's some that maybe could benefit from community supervision? And without knowing the bigger picture of how different classes are sentenced relative to this process, I think it's really hard to disentangle that. But again, a lot of this data, the intent is to help us refine and find more questions to help us understand our sentencing system better and our practices better. And then the other thing too is we looked at HPA's policy called their guidelines for setting minimum terms, and found that the most applicable factor or criteria that was used for setting minimum terms was around character and attitude, used most often. And then also just some other reminders against having minimum terms. With what can be helpful is, sometimes with data, you're maybe not necessarily doing an evaluation trying to say this is effective or that's effective. having benchmarks and sort of monitoring trends over time can be very, very valuable so that you know where you're started, where you're going. As different policy changes happen, you can go back and reference those trends and see maybe what can be improved, what could be better. And so, a lot of this data could be a way to help set some baseline understandings of what we know and what we've seen so far for any questions and data projects that come out of this or moving forward. And with that being said,
We just, one comment. Okay, so, there's a lot of Class C, felons, on probation. So it might help, not for this exercise, but it might help to take a look at what are those Class Cs that the courts are resentencing in prison, because I can tell you the vast majority of the folks that are sentenced to Class C nonviolent offenses, they aren't sentenced to prison, they're sentenced to probation. So look at those cases that the courts get fed up with and said, okay, we're gonna send you to prison now. I think what you'll see is you'll see a difference in the guys that are coming to prison are the ones who aren't abiding by the terms and conditions of probation. And they get chance after chance after chance. They're not doing probation, they're not doing the services they're supposed to be. Those are the guys that are resentenced. And as a result of being resentenced after about 4, 5, 6, 7 years in the community, they're coming in with enough pre-sentence credits to be at level 3. So I think if you do that kind of a deep dive, you'll see, one, we'll understand who the courts are sending to me, to HPA first. And then that's why their need is so great. That's why they're high risk. Because they've had opportunities in the community time after time to abide by terms and conditions that they do not.
And to follow up on that, there's enough cases with their remainder of prison time, maybe less than 18 or 12 months, and they may not be able to benefit from any available programs because they would be lower on the priority. So basically, by the time when they come in, they've got short time on their sentence and they're learning more criminal institutional behavior when they max out and go back into the community. The other thing, Judge Souza can validate, verify that there are certain cases that exercised under the law, the judges have the discretion to set a lower number of years under the open 5 cases, and they may get a 1.5 years, 2-year sentence on the open 5. And again, that poses another problem when we set minimums, how the minimums set, the number of years, and whether or not they can take advantage of institutional programs, especially when it comes to substance abuse.
Yeah, I think between the risk assessment data and, also if we are talking about people who are in the community first, that is just another, I think, point that emphasizes the need for programming and services in the institution. It's, the community, they're in the, there's a whole other question about the community and what's going on there, but, that does mean that, some people have already tried, they're at high risk and need a lot of programs and services, so.
This is in no way critical of the courts. They're trying to do what they can to minimize penetration into the criminal justice system. But eventually, by the time they do get to DCR and HPA, I mean, they've blown the chances. And when they come in, they finally realize, oh, I didn't realize I was gonna come to prison.
I think that's why Steve has been pitching the idea.
Yeah. But
The issue with Hope though is that they get so many chances on Hope. That's exactly the type of people that Tommy is concerned about and Fred as well. Is that it's the whole probationers in general that are coming in with so much time credit because they've been on whole probation for 10 years. And these guys can't do anything with them once they finally get them. Once the court finally makes a determination that this person's not going to stop using drugs, they're not going to follow the rules of probation, and they're no longer appropriate candidate for probation. Some of these guys have, based on their mods that they've been given, they have 4 of the 5 years already served. And then I feel bad for them because what do you do with them at that point? What can they do?
I think we
But
should
if you look
switch
at
to
the
the
data
next
to look
slide.
at
I don't want us to get too
the-
sidetracked with
Oh,
probation,
yeah.
since there's no
That's the
probation
way.
data here today, and I feel like we can start speculating a lot.
Just finish up the.
Apologize if I already speculated too much there. Yeah, so limitations and considerations, to think about here. I've already mentioned the barriers to collecting data. You know, just kind of an overall takeaway I had with every data project. It's not unique to here. It's pretty much every criminal justice research project I've worked on. You know, most of the systems that we work with, they're information systems. They're designed to help people do their jobs and collect that information, and to transform that into data to do analysis is where it can be really challenging, especially you know, whether it's a technological challenge or just finding ways to capture that information, in particular that you can use that. So that was, it wasn't even so much sample size, but it was actually the inability to collect a lot of the potential explanatory and predictor variables that would explain sentencing outcomes. And sentencing, another reason it's very tricky is that when you're building, so you'll see I didn't do any regression or predictive models. It's maybe even less of an issue of sample size, or partly sample size, but it's, and Angie mentioned some challenges too with her regression models, is when you have explanatory variables that are interrelated and overlap, it's very, there's a lot of information you need to build your model correctly. So a great example of this is we have offense seriousness to consider. So there's already a way that class A, B, and C already structure offense severity. So there's that to consider. And then there's a way that we could categorize offenses into offense severity. And then HPA has in their criteria something around offenses. So when all those things overlap, building more predictive models to try to say, well, what is actually predicting these outcomes? We isolate specific factors is a little difficult for a variety of reasons. So just want to cover there why, you know, we really focus more on descriptive data to help give, you know, some baseline trends to cover some of the things that we know relate to sentencing outcomes, and also to propose what are some other big picture questions that we could ask as well. And that way we can think about what is that other data that we need, what is other information that we can collect, and having all these experts in the room is helpful for me because I could hear hypotheses basically about what we think is going on and then try to figure out how else we can get more information out there. The other thing too, you know, so we did spend some time looking at how the HPA's policy for guidelines policy for, I don't have the title in front of me right now. How the policy for setting minimum terms, which has the different levels and the criteria associated with them. So we were able to look at files and document what is the criteria that was most applicable and recommended. So, you know, one way to evaluate a policy is to kind of look through documentation and say, this is how this policy is being used, and you know, track it that way, which we're kind of showing you, you know, based on the criteria that's recorded, how is that related to the minimum terms that are being set. I think one of the challenges with doing maybe more of a deeper dive into the specific policy, or even just the criteria themselves. I mean, in some ways, a policy is the decision-making itself is separate from who's actually making the decision. I mean, other states have different forms of sentencing policies as well. So some of it too is, you know, is this the right policy? I mean, that's not the right term, is this the right policy? But is this policy helping us achieve the goals that we want? And so you could look at the criteria that are in that policy and say, like, do these criteria relate to the outcomes that we care about? So there's certain criteria in that policy that I think we could measure with other data around like offense seriousness or like criminal, trying to find the right nature of offense, criminal history. So criminal history, for example, you can count prior arrests, you can count prior convictions, and so we could do something to look at, you know, what are criteria and what are the outcomes associated with it. But I do think one thing I was unsure about that's a bit challenging is the criteria for that was used the most around criteria for character and attitude. Yeah. So because we want to say, and we know that that's a criteria being used, but how will we use data to measure that criteria so that we can say, are these the criteria that we, want to look at to influence minimum term setting, and do they predict the outcomes we care about? So we started, that's kind of why we framed, sort of these different descriptives and tables and wanted to go through that. And then finally, I think the other thing is, again, this is a starting point to provide a little more information around minimum terms so that we have averages, we have that we've been able to look at, but to provide information on different things that are relating to minimum terms around offense seriousness or the different offense types or the multiple convictions that people have. But again, I think there's some larger questions too that would really help put this in perspective about, of people being sentenced to felony Cs, how many are going to probation, how many go to prison and go through this process? How does our system operate overall? So there's a lot of other big picture questions to think about. And I also, given that HB a paroling authority too, I'm sure they're very interested in understanding how minimum terms relate to time served and how all of this works together as a rehabilitative system. Because, this presentation, we're talking about averages as if it's just a sentence length. But the whole point of a sentence is a lot of other things. And so how can minimum terms be set to support people to encourage better outcomes so they're ready for parole release, so that when they approach their minimum term and they go to a parole hearing, how does that help encourage them to prepare for release or to engage in the programs you want them to? And how does time served, because overall you also have, people might not be released after their first hearing. They might be released and be revoked. And for the individual, it's not just a minimum term, it's how much time they're actually in the institution. And that's the punishment. It's not just the minimum term, it's the overall sentence. And we also talk about deterrence. So how do minimum terms that are set impact deterrence, and how do they impact? Also, we care about more retributive functions, about there's a harm to society. So how does this term length relate to the harm to society? So there's all these different goals that we're thinking about. And these are just averages that we're presenting, but those averages mean something in other contexts as well. Which I don't want to turn into a criminology theory class right now, but just kind of providing some other big context of interpreting this data. So that would be everything. And there's.
Thank you, Dr. Thank you. But that was a lot. The last 2 hours of the one information that would have been interesting if we could have had that at the beginning of our journey. But questions that have never been asked before, that been asked, take a while to collect data. When we look at, I want to go around the room real quick and get some final thoughts from folks, and then we'll discuss next steps. But understanding that in our voting last meeting, would the administration of justice be better served by removing the responsibility of setting minimum terms of imprisonment from the Hawaii Paroling Authority? 11 of you said yes, and 7 of you said no. So, this is often like now that we have information in front of us, has anything changed in our thought process? Are we still unclear from our perspective in the system whether or not HB is doing what they're supposed to be doing? So with this new information, I'd just like to go around the room and just gather some final thoughts on the journey that we've had and how this information has impacted your decision making, if any. I'm just going to start naming some people around the room. And if you have something to say. If you don't, you just say no comment. All right. The Judge Susan, can I throw you on the spot?
I guess so. Well, I just want to say that it's been a real education for me to be, and an honor for me to be part of this task force. I certainly learned a lot from everyone and their perspective here. Especially, some of the representatives of the victim community and some of the things that I've learned from them has been really valuable to me in terms of how I run my courtroom. Some of the procedures that I have refined along the way to make sure that people feel comfortable at all times in my courtroom and to the extent possible in the court complex itself. I've also appreciated just, it's been a while since I practiced before the Paroling Authority, and so before the parole board, and it's been nice to get a refresher on what they do. I think the numbers have been interesting to see. I wasn't able to attend the last couple of meetings, my apologies. I think in the 2 meetings ago, I was in the midst of a murder trial that had gone on for like 3 weeks, and the jury was looking at me and like, we got to get out of here, Judge. And so I just couldn't break away. And in the last meeting, I was off island, but I did watch the meetings on YouTube. Thank you so much for posting them online. It's always very educational to watch those meetings and what gets said. And I know that there was a vote, taken last time, and I think that prior to the vote, everybody got to express their opinion as to why they were voting the way they were voting. And the vote got taken, and I think that we have to honor the vote that got taken last time. I will say that I think from the very start of this journey, I have felt like there were only 4 destinations we could have ended up in, and I still feel that way. The first destination was to do nothing and to keep it with the Paroling Authority, maybe refine their procedures a little bit, but essentially leave the responsibility with the Paroling Authority to set minimum hearings. The second option would have been, which I'm growing, I have to be honest, I'm growing increasingly fond of for a number of reasons that I'm happy to get into with you guys if you want. But the second option in my mind is to set a uniform statutory minimum as a percentage of the maximum, and to build in a procedure that would allow perhaps for judges to reduce that minimum with strong mitigating circumstances, which of course will be subject to immediate appellate review, or to increase that minimum if based on findings and offense variables that are made after a proper procedure in court. So that would be the second option, to set it by statute, where most everyone would fall into sort of this default. This is your minimum. It's known upfront and early that your minimum would be the percentage of the maximum. And then the third and fourth destination, I think, are variations of each other, which would be that the courts, we would recommend that the responsibility would shift over to the courts to hand out the minimum at the same time we hand out the maximum, the indeterminate maximum sentence. The variables would be either we just recommend that to the legislature that, hey, the committee, the task force in its wisdom has voted for that. But by the way, you guys need to know that there are going to be significant changes that need to be done to Chapter 706 in order to allow the judges to start handing down minimum sentences and keep that in harmony with constitutional concerns. And I think that there are real active constitutional concerns with judges handing down minimum sentences and having to make factual findings regarding offense variables in doing so, either upward or downward. I think that there are real issues with that. And I maintain that I've said this from the very first meeting. And then the fourth one would just be, like I say, a variation on that, is to tell the legislature, hey, look, we're recommending that the judges do it. But there are going to be major statutory changes that need to be made. But, we want this done. So we recommend that this responsibility then, in our recommendation, we're recommending that this responsibility shift from the Paroling Authority to the judges in, let's say, 2030 or give them a 5-year window to say, look, you guys must, whatever statutory changes need to be made, you guys have to do it within X amount. To me, those are really the four, have always been the four options that we've had. The vote got taken last time, and I think that we need to respect that vote. And we need to report back to the legislature that the majority of this task force believes that it should shift back to the courts to set minimums. But in doing so, I just want to be very clear once again that I think that we would be remiss if, in reporting back to the legislature, we did not make them strongly aware of the constitutional concerns that are going to arise with court setting minimum hearings, and the need then for the sentencing statute to be completely revised. And we need to look at sentencing statutes from other jurisdictions where judges are setting mandatory or not mandatory, but parole minimums. So that we make sure that when we finally do make that shift, we are doing so in a way that is not going to invite a constitutional challenge. And then I think also just to finish up, I think we also, in our report back to the legislature, we need to talk about some of the good things that the Paroling Authority has been doing with respect to all of the cases that they've handled, how they've been applying their guidelines, and you know, the great measures that they've taken to make sure that they've adhered to their guidelines. And then finally, I think we need to also let the legislature know that there is also this possibility out there, again, me making the personal pitch here, that there is a middle ground where we can just simply set the minimum by way of statute, where neither the parole board or the courts need to be in the business of making factual offense variable judgments up or down, and thereby inviting a lot of the constitutional concerns that come with that, if those factual variables are not proven beyond a reasonable doubt or admitted to by the defendant. So that's all I have.
I'm sorry, could we just clarify? The vote last time was 11-7 when we talked about there's 3 votes. Talked about just the system as it was. The vote was 9-9, as you said in your email, there was no consensus. The vote was 9-9 as it related to the recommendations from Fred and ours and HCR. So there was no consensus.
Thank you for that clarification. I wasn't here, so thank you for that clarification.
But you know, because I think what your comments were based on the fact there's a consensus, but we don't have any minutes, I don't think, from the last meeting that showed that vote. But the vote was 9-9 if the recommendations from Fred were included.
I see.
So thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Can you go next?
Sure. So, you know, this has been quite a journey. And I'm talking like 3 years. When this matter cropped up about HPA minimums. So the early discussion with Representative Nakayama was, let's get this on the table once and for all. And I think that's what has been accomplished thus far. What I do propose is that similar to, well, let me just put it very clearly. I think judges, and this is no disrespect for the courts and the judiciary, the judges should judge and adjudicate and render a sentence. When it comes down to the rehabilitation side, leave it to DCR and or HPA. The reality is we don't have enough community homes, we don't have enough community programs, we don't have a whole lot of things out there that can keep people out of prison, let alone be released after prison. So that is a problem here and nationwide. I don't want to see Hawaii become like some of the other states where when minimums are set, it's not done in person. A review board will look at the sentence, review the individual's history, and then render a minimum sentence, and that be done. There's no one-on-one, there's no legal representations or anything else. I don't want to see that. I think Hawaii is in a great situation because of its numbers and its geographic location, which also impacts its recidivism. Hawaii's recidivism rate may be higher than other states because in other states, if you commit something in Florida and you get maxed out, you go to another state, commit a crime, Florida's not going to count that. You know, there's been national studies that have indicated trying to compare states' parole system in other states is almost next to impossible because of the laws and the type of paroling guidelines. It's so different. And as far as the sentencing guidelines. But Hawaii HPA is not perfect by any sense. There's a lot of things that could be changed, and we stated that in our recommendations as far as converting part-time positions. And we are intending to go public hearings. We want to address the administrative rules, which have been long outdated. And we want to have a contract position with a legal background can help draft amendments and updates to the administrative rules. And when we look at board members, we prefer to have, in the last 2 sessions, have board members who have backgrounds in criminal justice, the judiciary, law enforcement, corrections, and treatment programs, which I believe right now the board members are of that makeup. Previously, it was based on political whim and assignment. And I think that's also reflective in the type of statistics you see as far as minimums and Supreme Court rulings. We also wanted to, what I had also wanted to recommend was that to amend section 706-601 to remove the ability to waive preparation of pre-sentence investigation and make it mandatory for all cases. It's critical that PSIs arrive at DCR so that they can properly do a RAD assessment and programming assessment upon admission and intake. We also wanted to pass legislation to reduce that HBA have the ability to reduce court-imposed minimums. That serves as incentive as far as completion of program, institutional behavior, and affords HBA the ability to parole earlier than based on the minimum. As we do in our own setting of minimums, with the reduction of minimums offered to inmates. Reductions of minimums are heard every month by those inmates who submitted. And that's based on the institutional recommendations of the staff, facility staff, the branch, and the division head of Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. So with these type of changes, you know, we can improve the current process and keep it humane as possible versus what we've seen in other states. And I have been involved with other states for the last 7 years. And some of them are, like Georgia, are very content to do it their way without seeing an individual in person. Hawaii's law requires us to see individuals every year once parole has been denied. And we see individuals who have parole consideration prior to the end of the minimum term. We have paroled people, granted parole to those who haven't completed the minimum term and offered that as an incentive to finish their term, complete their programs, and get off parole as soon as their minimum term has been achieved. And or if we had reduced their minimum. So yeah, HPA does have the authority to make a lot of changes to the existing process, which is not necessarily revealed in the statistics that are gathered. But that's my take.
Thank you, Fred. Appreciate that. Tommy, minorities.
I missed a couple of the meetings, sorry, but I do think that, the current system is unique in that it provides a personal touch with the minimum term process. Not perfect. I do think that the guidelines which were established in 1989 could be updated, as can the administrative rules for HPA. I see that changes to the system are given to the courts and bureaucracy where it's not needed, but that's what some people want to task force believe. I personally will be testifying against any changes that will allow this minimum term hearing to go to the court, because I don't think it's appropriate. I do think the data was good, and I appreciate the council and governance, and I appreciate Aaron's work. But I do think the data doesn't drill down deep enough to all the different nuances that go into the minimum term process. In particular, those where the person's resentenced from probation to prison and already have 3 years of pre-sentence credits. I can tell you from being an HPA for 16 years, you would get people to come in for minimum term hearing that was on probation for a Class C felony for 7, 8 years. By the time the courts finally resent them to prison, the person has 3 years of pre-sentence credits, and they're automatically level 3 punishment. And so I think you ought to consider that when you look at it, and also look at any change to the HPA system should also look at why are those people coming to HPA from the courts? Why has the courts washed their hands of them and sent them here? And if you look at and look at who the courts decided to keep on probation, that gives you a better idea of where the failures are in the system and why the courts have washed their hands of them and sent them to us. Other than that, I think Fred was right. There's not enough services until the state has the political will to provide the diversion services up front on probation or even at first arrest. And for those that do come into the system, provide enough funding to DHS and Department of Health and the DCR to provide housing and appropriate handoff services in the community, we're gonna have what we have now. The other thing too is I think our recidivism rate is so high, it's because of the definition of recidivism. Remember now, other states probably do not use any new arrests, or maybe some do. But here, any new arrest, regardless if it's a technical violation of parole, or if it's a new arrest for a different case, regardless of the outcome of that case, that counts as recidivism. I don't think that's fair, because what it makes the recidivism rate artificially higher than it really is. So if you take a look at all the arrests that resulted in a conviction, I think you have a truer picture of recidivism, and the recidivism rate will be much lower than what we report now at 57 to 58%. All right.
Thank you. Lisa, anything else to add?
I would just say that, I think the vote, as Ms. Ferguson pointed out, there's no consensus. That really, a lot of people supported HPA's recommendations. There was also another vote concerning whether to take minimum terms away from the HPA. I haven't attended all the meetings. I didn't look at all the materials, however. I don't see a basis to take the minimums away from HPA, to tell you the truth. It appears to me that the one complaint that people have about HPA is that they're setting minimums too long in certain people's opinions. And I think the data from Council of State Governments, page 9 of their presentation, which looks at prison population and the downward trend. I think we have to look at why our prison population is going down. I mean, the courts, the police, and the prosecutors and the defense attorneys have really worked on reducing or diverting the number of people away from prisons. And what does that mean? That means that people who are going to prison, who are showing up at DCR and HPA, those are going to be people with more violent offenses, more criminal history, obviously more time with supervisory conditions such as probation, parole. And you know, inevitably, if you end up with these violent offenders or people with longer criminal histories in front of HPA, they're going to be longer minimum terms. The data from, I'm sorry, the data would show that looking at from January to June 2023, 75% or 77% of the people at the minimums were classified as medium or higher, meaning that their risk of recidivism was much higher than regular. So of course, then you're going to get longer minimum. In a way, the longer minimums for that the HPs are setting is basically a show of a success to diverting people away from the prison system. Unfortunately, there's not been an accompanying level of funding for the programs which would help people once they get into prison. Especially substance abuse treatment and any kind of rehabilitative counseling and so forth. As Tony pointed out, you know, there's no follow-up, unfortunately. A lot of times, you know, people don't have the ability to, or they can't figure out a way for housing outside of prison, which again causes recidivism rates to go up. So, but that's not HPA's fault. I mean, that's HPA is reacting to the people that are coming in, the circumstances in which those people are coming in, and they're dealing with them appropriately as per their policy. So I would have to say that the HPA's recommendations should be followed.
Thank you, Lisa.
And before Lisa finishes, she's kind of the expert on this, so I just wanted to, on the constitutional concerns, and I just, you know, right now, because we do have a lot of these Rule 40 petitions that come in where, you know, prisoners are challenging the constitutionality of their minimum sentence, and we do have this body of Supreme Court case law and whatnot. And you know, it's a thin body of law, but it's there, where we have the Intermediate Court of Appeals in the state of Hawaii that has said, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, that part of the reason why the HPA minimums do not implicate those constitutional concerns is because they are a separate and distinct procedure from the defendant's sentence. At least that's what the Webster case says. Drazen says that, the Starr case. If the setting of minimum sentences were not any longer separate and distinct from the defendant's sentencing hearing, but were set all together with the defendant's sentencing hearing, is it your belief, Lisa, that the courts would enjoy the same constitutional or statutory exemptions in the eyes of the appellate courts that the HPA does?
I can't say. I mean, as you point out, the case law is so thin. There's like 2 or 3 cases which look at the issue, and frankly, I think most of the case law focuses on the language from, you know, Apprendi and Aline, where they talk about any factor which increases either the statutory sentence which a person is facing, or statutory mandatory minimum which a person is facing. That implicates constitutional.
Yeah, it's an element, and it must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt or admitted to by the defendants. That's why when you look on the federal side, they have long, you know, they have long fights and big fights over a factual basis before they take the plea. Sometimes it lasts days because they have to drill down exactly as to what is it the defendant is pleading to that he did and what he didn't do, or she did or she didn't. And it just simply fundamentally change, I think, the procedures in state court as they currently exist. Would you agree?
Yeah.
And it would require significant changes to Chapter 706 to allow that to happen.
Yeah.
So this isn't a situation where we could snap our finger and say, oh, congratulations, courts, you guys now are in charge of setting minimums.
Sadly, no.
Right? It would take, there would be an implementation period, in your opinion.
Yes.
She's my lawyer. She represents the judiciary. I gotta be clear. She represents the judiciary as well, so we defer to her on a lot of stuff. So I just wanted to, before you continue.
The judicial action,
Oh,
but I
Alright.
do appear from front of the.
you do
judicial-
it, she does, okay, got it. All right. Sorry, thanks for that clarification.
Just to point out though, I mean, the federal system, you know, the sentencing guidelines are like gigantic. They're hundreds of pages and matrices and factors that go up and down depending on what, you know, what facts you do admit to or what facts must be proven, so.
And, you know, I know we have a number of members of this task force that certainly practice in federal court, and I would certainly defer to them and their expertise. But I don't think I'm stepping on a line here by saying that the sentencing process in federal court is much longer and much more involved than it is in state court.
Because of that, the constitutional issues that are raised and because of the sentencing guidelines, which are you know, mandatory, and so.
Yeah.
They spend all their time fighting about what factors and what facts are, so.
Thank you.
I'll move on. Thank you, guys. From the Department of Health, Brenda, any comments?
The Department of Health would want to keep it with the HPA. It allows for discretion. The numbers show that it currently seems consistent the way that HPA is using it, making their decisions. No clear basis shown to take it away, and that the alternative is not entirely well thought out yet and would require significant changes to the laws. That's it.
Thank you, Brenda. Hello, can you still hear?
Hello, yes, I am.
Thank you.
Okay, mahalo. The office has no comment to offer at this time. You know, given that this is only the second meeting that I've been in with the HCR task force, you know, not that all of this work is brand new to me. So I just want to start off my comment here today just by saying mahalo for all of the data and information this morning. It's quite a lot. So yeah, we're still processing that on this end. But Mark, I just want to say at this point, we have no further comment to add. And I just want to mahalo HPA's work and their recommendation and just acknowledge them. So yeah, I yield back to you, Mark. Mahalo.
Mahalo, Puike, thank you. Viola?
A lot to unpack here. I do support, you know, more programming, not just at the prison level, but also at the pretrial level. I think that there's a missed opportunity there. There's a lot of people that spend quite a bit of time in pretrial before, you know, resolution of their case, and I think that that is time that could be used a lot more productively. You know, if we're not changing this system, we should be, you know, increasing the amount of programming there, and I don't see any reason why we shouldn't be doing that. And I think that would lead to better outcomes, particularly on the neighbor islands, because we don't have, you know, facilities, you know, for them to go to. You know, it's always about bed space, and you know, the public defenders are always working very hard to get those bed spaces and get people into them. But it's you know, it's a lot of work for them to be doing that. And if there was, you know, more programming available, you know, at the county facilities, that would be a huge improvement. Fred mentioning not waiving PSIs, you know, I know a lot of the reason that that's being done is because there's just not enough pretrial writers, you know. So there's, I think, a real sustainability issue for the system itself. You know, when we're looking at probation, even the judiciary itself, you know, court staff. It's a real problem in the Fifth Circuit. I don't know about the other circuits, but court staff, probation, etc., you know, severely understaffed. And when you're in a situation like that, it's basically triage, you know. So we're not able to fulfill our mission, you know, under those circumstances. So I think that, you know, unless there's a lot more support, you know, for programming, housing, you know, etc. the system just kind of implodes on itself. If we do not change the system, I think, like I said before, reducing the amount of time for setting the minimum term, it's kind of low hanging fruit, so to speak. But I think that also addresses a lot of the concerns that I heard from that public hearing. There's a lot of gentlemen, particularly there was an interaction between an ACO and a former inmate, talking about dead time, or basically unproductive time. So for reducing that from 6 months to like 2 months, I think that's not unreasonable. I think that's achievable, within our current construct without changing too much. And I know HPA is, been making an effort. I don't think that was always the case, but, I do applaud the folks for reducing that amount of time, because I think that leads to a lot of, I think tension at the jails as well, or the prisons. And, just people feeling like they're not being treated fairly. I think the main reason that people want determine, having it before the judges is basically transparency, because they're not really seeing what's happening, at the parole board. I've been in front of the board, and Fred and the board members do an excellent job. They do a really thorough questioning, of the people, and it's I think it's overall a good process, but I do think that the constitutional issues are a little bit overstated. I don't think it has to be as complex as what they do in the federal system. I've practiced in Washington State where they do have a determinate system, and it's really, to me, a fair system. And I think that it's just kind of fear the unknown, and we're used to this particular system that we've had in here in Hawaii for so long. So it's like it's not broken by fixing it, But there's obviously an issue. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a task force. So just trying to make that I think if it's changed to determine it, it would be a more transparent system, and fair all the way around. A lot more factors would be considered, litigated. Yes, there would be more litigation, but are people's rights being respected if there isn't, this litigation going on, at the sentencing period? So I think it actually provides greater constitutional protections for defendants. The other thing that, wasn't discussed, but just looking at, slide 4, Native Hawaiians are 35.4% of census individuals. I think that's another reason, why we're here. We know that Native Hawaiians and then Pacific Islanders do not make up, 44% of the 45% of the population. So there's definitely some deep-seated issues there that need to be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you. Brandon, are you still here? Or you have to leave? He put some comments in the chat that I'll read later. Andrew, are you still here? Kennedy?
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you. Hold on. Let me log on. I appreciate the information today. I don't think it changes my mind very much. I definitely think the judges are in the best position to do it. I know constitutional concerns were raised. I don't think that's a barrier. Especially in light of Apprendi and things like that. That's more, 706.660.1 persistent offenders when you're going to go beyond. But as long as we're operating within the framework that's statutorily set, a class C's 1 to 5, I don't know what the constitutional concerns necessarily would be with having a determinate sentence. I know I've practiced in a lot of different jurisdictions. I came from New York and I do a ton of federal work. And, those are determinate sentences. And I know New York does a lot of determinate sentences. I just find those to be much better. I know one of the biggest things as a defense attorney, the hardest things is when you're trying to work a plea agreement out, talk to your client, it's like you're going to get open 10. Well, what does that mean? I'm like, I don't know. Could be 12 months, could be 8 years. Who knows? We'll figure it out. I think generally, at least over in Kona, the judges are involved. They know the case as well. They're in the better position to kind of make the decision. And sometimes as part of the plea negotiations, you do a pretrial conference or something. The judge can give an inclination, and you can kind of get on the same board or on the same page. Obviously the framework would need to be reworked, but I don't think that should be a barrier to making the system better. And I do believe that the judges making the decision would be better. Another point was brought up, like in the federal system, a lot more goes into the sentencing. I'm not sure how much more. Like, we definitely spend more time on sentencing memorandum and pre-sentencing input that goes to the judges, but I don't think that's a bad thing. And I think that sort of becomes the process because people know that the judges are going to be making the decision, and a little more effort goes into the sentencing hearing as opposed to just sometimes now, hey, we all know he's going to get prison or she's going to get prison, and we just sort of, it becomes a formality like a rubber stamp. If it is kind of a better case is put forward to represent the client or the prosecution to show why they deserve a higher sentence, I don't view that as a bad thing either. I mean, the judge's job is to set the sentence, or at least that's how I've always operated. So in my view, it's a much better system when the judges do the sentence, and a determinate sentence as well.
Thank you, Andrew. Pamela?
So as I said, we voted last time so that the data that we've got, doesn't change that. And then I think really sort of begs more questions. Although I think Angie did say too, that what the data shows is that there's consistent minimum set relating to the severity and degree of harm in the cases, is what one of her conclusions was. One of the questions that Mark sent out is, how we think that justice is best served in the criminal justice system. And so I think that that what's really great about the current paroling system is it really looks at, I think, clearly the safety of the public, and the nature of the offense, the degree of harm, and a very individualized look at what offenders need to really have a meaningful chance to be rehabilitated. But I think that we have to also look not only at the interests of community safety and convicted people, but also the interests of crime victims. And what system is there that will most honor, amongst other things, serving not only victims, but offenders, as I said. So I think that's really what one of the hallmarks of the Paroling Authority is making sure, which system will make sure that the statutory and other rights of crime victims in Hawaii are respected and enforced. And we see that system as the Hawaii Paroling Authority. And so in the stuff that I had sent to Mark, one of those rights is the right to be notified, which is a gateway right for all the other rights. If victims don't know that they have the right to be heard, they have the right to come and talk about restitution, about their safety, that they don't have a chance to exercise any of those rights. There's an automated victim notification system run by the Paroling Authority in conjunction with the Department of Corrections, with the judiciary. I don't want to, pick on the judiciary or anything, but because we're comparing systems, when the judiciary had an opportunity to be part of that automated system, they declined to do that. So the right to be heard. I know a lot of people have had comments about how victims feel in terms of being able to speak in each of those processes. But what the folks that work directly with crime victims we hear all the time is that victims feel validated in front of the parole board. They feel protected in an environment where the offender's family is not standing there. There's a message from the parole board that is very different in a way from the judiciary, which is although people say that once offenders have been convicted, that there should be acknowledgement that you are the victim, but often they feel there's not an acknowledgement of that, but there's a clear acknowledgement in front of the parole board about offender accountability, and a messaging about that you're the person who is harmed, and that we want to hear from you in terms of being able to set an appropriate sentence, and the right to restitution. the parole board is part of a national model with DCR and the Crime Victim Compensation Commission. It's a model restitution project. And as a result of their efforts, and this is CSG data that we worked with from FY 2013 to FY 18, the number of parolees paying restitution increased by 106%. And the number of restitution payments to victims increased by 135%. When we were working with Justice Reinvestment and CSG, and CSG attempted to get the equivalent data from the judiciary to track what's happening with restitution and to make changes, the judiciary declined to provide the data about what's happening with financial justice and restitution for crime victims. And so the metrics about measuring what it means to be a victim in the system and to have justice, clearly in what we see in our experience, the parole board is a better place for victims to receive those rights. And also, there's a very different dynamic in the judiciary when we've had problems and issues about notification and other stuff. It's a very different kind of insulated organization. When Tommy and Fred, as head of the Paroling Authority, we say, hey, we got a problem, people aren't being notified, stuff isn't in the system. Okay, what can we do? It gets changed. And so it's a very different dynamic in terms of when there are issues and concerns that victims have. By definitions of the system, not to say a negative thing about the judiciary relationship to that, but it's a very, very different place for victims, you know, where they can actually feel like that they got something out of the system. The system worked for them because they got the right to be heard. They got the right to restitution. So for victims, I think it's very, very important. But I also think that the consistency, the interest in having similarly situated offenders with the same history, the same dangerousness, the same everything, that looking at a system that gives them the equivalent minimum set is a really, really important hallmark of our system, that justice is about equally situated people getting the same types of penalties, having the same types of opportunities. I also think the Big Island talked about what it looks like, contrasting the judiciary with that, is the uneven application of pre-sentence reports, which go directly to the heart of whether or not people are sentenced appropriately, whether or not victims had a chance to be heard. So even people who, you know, have supported changes acknowledge that that the other system, which is a system run by the judiciary, is a system that perhaps does not have the same hallmarks of consistency and fairness that you might have at the Paroling Authority. We asked for data. One of the things we asked for about data is we asked for if there's an alternate system with an alternate organization making these, you know, is there any data of sentencing practices of individual judges for similarly situated offenders, you know, outcomes with those, was there consistency? And so that certainly would be important information for us to decide, are we going from an organization that has consistency and fairness, and we're going to have select another, you know, organization that is not shown in the data, which we have not enough for that I can see, that shows that. And also, I think, you know, we asked a lot about data for victims, what's the impact on victims, and I know that there's no data that, you know, so I don't know if that's a if there is no data or that was not.
I mean, there's information about, that's another thing, but it's not data. It's
Right. So in terms of making our decisions, there's nothing that we can look at that's a value of that. Also, you know, we do collect a lot of data related to the judiciary in relation to our crime victim compensation fee, and we've had data for probably 1998 about that. And what I could say, sort of extrapolating in the difference across courts, across judges, across you know, the jurisdictions, is that one of our last pieces of data was 2 weeks in the life of the Hawaii court in family court, 100% of compensation fees ordered in domestic abuse cases, on Oahu, 24% of the domestic abuse cases ordered compensation, which pays crime victims compensation. So we have some metrics, but they relate obviously to the work that we do. But what those metrics show is that there's a lack of consistency. There appear to be no standards used across the courts, and at least as to that metric of looking at consistency. So what we've seen, not only through our work with victims and restitution, and in that slice of looking at the court system, that the hallmarks of things that we want that are described in the model penal code early on in one of the presentations as to what we're striving for are not, are more found with HPA than another organization.
Thank you, Pam. Miles, you still there? Miles Briner? Sonoy?
First, thank you guys for doing all of this hard work for, sounds like many years. I'm still the greenhorn, so I'm kind of just sort of taken aback by how much I actually don't know about this entire process and what it entails. It's clear everybody's super passionate about this in general. And, you know, I come from a small county, Maui County, and so, you know, for me, I see the victims that are coming through. And I see all your folks' side, and including like when you mentioned about us doing things the way that we've always done it, not knowing that there's a problem. I think we just don't even know that the problems exist, right? Because we're only looking in our own little silos. However, I still have many questions, and I'm sure it's just my way of just kind of processing all of this information from the start. And so I don't have too much more to add other than I'm excited to see what comes about with all of this, including the data, and data is everything. And so I'm excited to see whether we can collect better data and how that helps this process be a lot more streamlined and how much more we can get from this and sort of be hopefully a role model for other states to do it well. And so, but I'm appreciative that you guys are allowed me to be part of this.
Thank you, Cindy.
So thank you.
Martha?
Okay, well, thank you. Yeah, it's been really eye-opening to listen to everybody's input from different sectors, and then all the data, even though it had, as you described, limitations, it's still a good stepping stone to how you can do better things. So that part's exciting. I do want to say in this overview summary slide packet, and there's a really good summary of what went on in the meetings, just because the vote process was very lively, very heated, well coordinated. We don't know in the summary on July 2024, it says discussed and debated the options, but doesn't note that we voted. I would just, if we use this in anything in the future, we want to add that because we did vote. So I appreciate that. As far as, again, I still haven't, from my perspective, yet thinking through for victims, I haven't seen the evidence that the current system is failing in any way. It seems really a model in that it's very individualized and thorough and looks at all those variables that they list out. It does seem like maybe there should be a review for updating to see if there's something that needs to be updated in this year, this current practices. I also see the need for maybe, not maybe, there should be a different way to encourage victim participation, because it seemed like maybe sometimes it's about a notification system or a letter, and those are all valuable, but there's got to be more to it to get a victim to participate in a system that really isn't focused regularly on them. And so how do you get people to feel they want to participate if they, one, think they'll be discounted, or two, they're fearful, or, you know, so I just would say we should look at more ways to include them wherever you end up putting the system. Obviously, I think minimum hearing is, from what I'm saying, should still stay with HPA, just because of that individualized approach. I always get nervous when there's a cookie cutter approach. The one thing that did catch my ear was Erin when she said, what is our goal? What is the purpose for the minimum settings? And I think there should be clarity around that. If it really is to decrease, and no one has said this outright, so I'm not saying it, but if it is to decrease minimums, I think that should be looked at more openly as a discussion point, because community may have input on that too.
But if we're really just trying to do what's best in each case for all parts of the system, the community rehabilitation issues, punishment issues, and individual victim safety, it seems like a more individualized approach is better. But look at ways to improve it, and clearly there's need for data and data to capture that. But anyway, I don't think I have anything else to add. And at some point, maybe I missed maybe how we'll use that survey. So if someone could talk a little bit about what we're gonna do with the survey, that would be helpful, because that's important. Other than that, that's all I have. Thank you.
Did I miss anybody online? Is everybody there?
Mark, Brandon Seagal wrote something in the chat. He had to go.
Yes.
I think Brandon might be back on.
I'm back. It was a quick hearing. Thank you. Thank you. I'll just rest on my comments in the chat, but basically, you know, I think I appreciate these presentations today. But for me, I think the biggest problem, the reason why a lot of us felt like the system needed to be changed in the way that we voted on last time is because of the arbitrariness of some of the decisions. And I think the lack of data kind of reinforces that belief for me there. So that was my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon. Or are you on?
And I think Miles wanted to say something, but I don't know if he's at his.
Miles, are you on?
Guess not.
Miles
Was on.
Okay. That's twice already we give it a chance. We'll come back again. Glory? No problem.
Yeah, so, I mean, obviously I concur with Fred and Tommy and Lisa, and I'll kind of piggyback off what Pam was saying, is that I don't think we've allowed enough time for victims and how it affects them to be heard. I mean, in the time I've been sitting where I'm at, I'll hopefully never get to 16 years where Tommy was in that position, but I've spoken to hundreds of victims, and they appreciate the fact to go in front of the parole board to be heard in person, and they feel safe. I've also, for the last 3 years, been speaking to inmates about parole expectations and what they should be doing on parole. And they know about this task force. So I'll just leave this for you to figure out, and they're wondering what the decisions we made because they want to change. So I'm pretty sure you can figure out why they want to change, but they don't like to be confronted on their downfalls. And I'll kind of end it with this. You know, I thank everybody for their participation and things like that. But one thing I did notice is that for a lot of some of the meetings that were very important, i.e. the mock hearings that HPA put on, a lot of people wasn't here. Didn't participate, or if they were here, weren't paying attention. And then show up when we voted last week. I thought that was just kind of unprofessional in my eyes. That's all I got.
Thank you, Corey. Just one more time, I'll just shout out to Miles if you're there. If not, we'll move on. So, there's a part of me as the chair that thinks that this conversation needed to occur for the whole year. Yeah, and from the beginning, it was never for me, that HPA is doing, not doing what they're supposed to be doing, but it's a matter of whether or not we're working in conjunction with the entire system. Working. Yeah, I think a lot of good concerns have been brought up. And when you look at the voting, would the administration of justice be better served by removing the responsibility of setting minimum terms of imprisonment from Hawaii Paroling Authority? That was an 11 said yes and no said no. I think when that type of voting like that, the information that we just received today, there is a lot of uncertainty. Yeah. And I don't think it's a lack of transparency. I just think we're so set in our institutional ways that people don't understand why things are doing good. I too have learned a lot about HPA at this particular point in time. with the information and just from Fred and Tommy's conversations. Thank you, Judge Souza, for the judiciary point of view, which is always helpful in this. You know, those other questions were pretty much, or two of the other questions. One was better served by keeping the current practice with the HPA submitted recommendations. You remember that question, Fred? That was an 8 yes and 9 no.
Actually, so I weighed in afterwards and it became 9-9 because she was at a.
Okay, we'll double check out that.
Can you double check that? Yeah,
Yeah.
'cause I.
The
that was
question
about-
3
yeah.
was the same, 8 and 9. Yeah. I think I remember that, but we'll follow up on that. Yeah. But what I'm trying to say, clearly it's happening or split. Yeah, in terms of those who want a different way and those who want to maintain their current practices. And I think, so where does that lead us as this task force is really, you know, sharing with the legislature, the discussions throughout the year, the final vote, and then the recommendations. A lot of the recommendations we heard today. Yeah, I don't think there's gonna be a real drastic change right now. It's just that I think we've done our first step. And in assessing that there isn't enough people in the state of Hawaii that feels that some type of reform needs to occur. Yeah. So when we look at the next step, which is creating that legislative report, we are going to time sequence it in all the discussions that we've had in the past meetings, and then end with the vote and explaining both sides. Yeah, and the recommendations being that if anything short, I think once we get a draft out and we pass it out, everybody add to it. You know, and track, and I think the next meeting, if we have one, would be the final draft.
What I picture is the report, and I'd like people's feedback on this, is just like Mark said, like just outlining what happened in each of the meetings, because the way that I'm hearing it, like, I don't know if there is an official recommendation to really put forward. I don't think there was enough agreement. I don't think, even with the voting, I think maybe the best way to go about this is just outlining what happened, outlining the vote, including HPA's, written, statement that you put out, and, and making sure that people know where they can find the information, they can watch the recordings, et cetera, but I just want to make sure that everybody is comfortable that as far as like an official recommendation to put forward, like, for me personally, I don't think this task force is there. But we can always, just write something up and get feedback then too. I guess I don't need an answer right now, but that's kind of what I'm picturing, is just outlining what happens throughout this process.
Yeah, Mark, Steve's not here, but he would have wanted to register his support for HPA.
Thank you.
I think that, sort of reflecting what happened also needs to reflect that as the data, the original data from, Carl's presentation, and his concerns about the constitutionality of the current system that I believe we backed off on, that as you pulled up additional data, and the comments that you're going to incorporate in your data, that, your data was informed, I think, by a lot of that information, that the PowerPoints also include or changed or footnoted to reflect some of the inconsistencies or sort of inaccuracies, not, with broader statements, that they're clarified by the information that was provided and I think accepted by the folks that did the data, so that it doesn't appear anybody looking at it thinks that there's a conclusion to make that isn't actually the conclusion that you would make if you had heard the other input, that
If I could clarify too, we'll have more of a research report, like
Okay.
methods, limitations.
Okay, so it really will
Context,
be
yeah.
broad enough,
Yeah.
and so, you know,
This is just enough to keep it simple
So
for
that-
discussion here, and I mean, I'm comfortable with sharing drafts of that to make sure context is clear and. Things like that, really, yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, that was my concern. with the If you and I think once we saw your report, then if you matched it up together, then it could help explain that there's so many level threes.
Yeah.
In testing right now, right? But then when you look at yours and say, well, the majority of it's sort of high on the character and attitudes and criminal history, then that tells me we are putting the more risky people in prison. So the right people are going to prison. But it's, you know, and the risk factors are 75% of those are scoring up higher. So it tells me that the right people are going to prison.
Yeah, I mean, I basically shared context and all of that, and, you know, I think we all have, I mean, I think that's the issue where there is limitations, so we have hypotheses and other maybe research questions, and maybe recommend additional data or research questions.
yeah, can't we also reflect what we weren't able to get data on, that the questions we had about the impact on kind of victims and their rights and stuff, that specifically it stated that those important questions were not addressed in any of the data purpose.
No, we could,
Just as.
Yep.
Is there a deadline? I know previously there was like an August 8th deadline or something. And
The deadline got extended. The commission put in a request to Rep. Takayama. He didn't set a specific deadline, but we just requested extension.
Okay.
But with that said too, you know, if anyone would like to write out some of their thoughts similar to like Fred, I mean, seriously, like, it's really helpful, right? Because it's difficult to go through every single meeting and make sure that every single viewpoint is reflected accurately. It just is. So, you know, I think we're gonna take the broader, you know, route, like, we're not gonna directly quote people, but if there's something that you wanna make sure is in the report and you wanna make sure that that's reflected, it would be really, really helpful to email Mark or I or Tara. Yeah, that would be helpful.
Just like to close with this. The intent in the resolution to form the task force, I think has been accomplished because the more people now are educated, and education is a key to understanding. And people are starting to realize now the complexities of actually doing minimums and its impact throughout the system. Whether it be pretrial, when we look at supervision and intake service center reports, to when it comes down to sentencing, to initial intake at admission for prison facilities, to programming, to community resources or not, as well as when they do go on parole or do they max out. It's really a system type of thing. And now we have defense, we've got prosecution, we've got the judiciary, and of course, what parole and corrections kind of knew all the time. But now at least it's on the table, and the legislature should look at investing for helping develop a database, you know, providing funds for a database, a comprehensive database that includes judiciary as well as public safety or corrections and rehabilitation, and involve community stakeholders. Because otherwise there'll never be any funding to improve the community. So speaking more now as a citizen, the concern is for our children and our grandchildren who are going to inherit all the stuff that we're doing, as well as who comes out of the system. And when we look at the current shooting rages on the west side and now coming central and the east side, I mean, it's getting absolutely ridiculous. I mean, how do you prevent that? Some we know is probably gang related and others not than just random drama and drama and such. I mean, but I think task force has laid out and indicated and provided education for everybody to understand that this is not an easy thing.
Okay, great.
Sorry,
No.
sorry, you're,
You know, we're close. Wanna leave it at
the
that.
survey, I just wondered what you're gonna do with the
Oh,
survey.
the survey, or are you gonna put that into a report, the survey responses?
That was the plan. Well, let's look at it first. We're gonna coordinate it. I think there was like 7 or 8 of you that responded. Okay. Yeah, it wasn't the full group, and it was hard questions, but it just hopefully we try to get a feel of what people were thinking as we make that decision. So thank you everyone again for the year and all the work that you've done. We will be contacted by email and in terms of the next meeting and then copies of the draft. So, mahalo. You safe travels. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.